Hi all, and very welcome to this webinar on biodiversity and finance, why and what. This webinar is hosted by Swesif, Sweden's Sustainable Investment Forum, and Swesif is an independent non-profit association that was founded in 2003 and have about 125 members, most of which are asset owners and asset managers. My name is Åsa Moberg and I'm a member of the board of Swesif and I will moderate this webinar. So our agenda is that Beatrice Crona, who is professor at Stockholm Resilience Center, leads a research program at the Royal Academy of Science and also is engaged in the newly started Sustainable Finance Lab, will set the scene and educate us all on the role of biodiversity for sustainable development and for a healthy economy. And the idea is to give us improved and science-based knowledge on this important and complex area. And Beatrice will also get support from a couple of colleagues, Gustav Engström and Johan Gars, who are both researchers at the Beijer Institute of Ecological Economics. And Sarah Cornell could not join today, unfortunately, but I think they will do a good job on their own, the three of them. Their presentation will be followed by shorter statements by three invited speakers representing different organizations who will highlight ongoing or emerging initiatives to address the biodiversity issue in the finance sector. And the speakers are Gemma James from the PRI, Anne-Marie Bohr from Finance for Biodiversity Pledge, and Magnus Enfel from WWF, who will present the task force on nature-related financial disclosure. And then following these presentations, there will be the opportunity to ask questions to all of the speakers. So as Kim said, please write your questions in the Q&A, and I will try to handle as many as possible at the end of the webinar. But now let's get into the details. Please, Beatrice.
Thank you very much, Åsa. I'll attempt to share my screen here and give me 1 second. Can I just have an yes if you can see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I'll jump straight in because we are on a tight schedule. Lovely, I can't see any of you, but lovely to have you join today. And we're going to talk about why we should care about biodiversity. This is, of course, an extensive area of research, and there are three key documents that have come out recently that synthesize decades of research on biodiversity as it relates to economics particularly, and a little bit of finance. The 2019 Global Assessment Report on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, produced by the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES for short, which is the equivalent to the IPCC for biodiversity. The second one is the Dasgupta Review on the Economics of Biodiversity, commissioned by the UK Chancellor of the Exchequer in March 2019, and also a joint report that came out earlier this year by the IPCC and IPBES, which specifically focuses on the links between biodiversity and climate. I will draw on these as well as other research to outline what biodiversity is, how we depend on it, and why investors should be concerned. Because to understand how biodiversity is linked to well-being of societies and specifically economies, you need to understand that biodiversity is not just the number of species. It is diversity within species, so genetic diversity. It is, of course, between species as well. That is important, but it's also between different types of ecosystems. But biological communities around the world are becoming more and more similar to each other in both managed and unmanaged systems, within and across regions. So what you might ask, what is really the problem with having a few high-performing species in a system, or similar ecosystems across an entire region for that matter? Because after all, retaining biodiversity we know can be inefficient and costly. But here is why I'm hoping to explain. Let's see, most agricultural industry scale cropping systems rely on one or only a few species. These monocultures, what we call them, are highly susceptible to pest outbreaks, to drought, to any kind of disturbance really to which this particular crop, often genetically modified, is susceptible. We've seen it time and time again. And I'm going to give you a little example. And I chose it because it's just easy to comprehend and visualize. This is a coastal landscape you're seeing, transformed to produce one commodity, the tiger prawn, and what we call the scampi, for the global market. In the 1990s, the white spot virus, up there in the left-hand corner, hit tropical shrimp farms, and they spread like a wildfire, causing massive die-offs and drastic declines in yields globally. And the reason for this was homogenization of the landscape, with the same species being farmed as far as the eye can see. And what you are seeing here is row upon row of intensive shrimp farms. Another example is Swedish forestry, which is dominated by spruce and pine. But spruce is highly susceptible to drought. And when it's stressed, it's also more vulnerable to insect outbreaks, like bark beetles, or granbarkborre for the Swedes in the room, currently causing huge amounts of problems for forestry across Sweden. And you see all these brown trees here, they're all trees that have died as a result of insect attack. Now, coniferous trees, or trees with needles, they also burn more easily than deciduous trees, trees with leaves, which can form natural fire or fuel breaks, as you see in this picture here. And in fact, increasing tree species diversity is now even promoted as a climate change adaptation response in the US to deal with the catastrophic fires in recent years. But this is a very real threat in the Nordics as well. As an example, the end of the year bill of Länsförsäkringar for extreme weather related events in 2018 was 712 million Swedish crowns, which was more than 100 million Swedish crowns over the 10-year average. And diversity in this context is important because of redundancy, because different species have different tolerance to different kinds of disturbances. You can take trees, as in this picture. We see here deciduous trees like the birch. They burn less intensely, if at all, but at the same time, they're kind of susceptible more to drought. We have spruce in the middle, which burns much more easily, is susceptible to bark beetle attack and to drought and to storms. And then we have the pine, which is much more fire resistant and resilient to storms, but very susceptible to moose grazing, which is one of the reasons we're seeing so much spruce in Sweden. So having multiple species to uphold one function, like producing timber, for example, or multiple ecosystems providing a similar service, like having different types of coastal ecosystems providing storm protection, this is an insurance policy. When one species or ecosystem is negatively affected by this disturbance, another one can step in and still maintain the relevant function. And this, to me, and in science, captures the essence of what biodiversity is and why it's important. It's essentially portfolio diversification. For the same reason that you as investors diversify risk through a broad set of investments to ensure financial return, now and in the future, maintaining biodiversity is a risk management strategy for an uncertain future. So clearly, as a society, we depend on biodiversity, but an estimated 1 million species of animals and plants are currently threatened with extinction on land and in water. It's slightly less than a fifth. And this rate of extinction is unprecedented in human history. And if we look across groups and habitats, on average, 25% of species are threatened, which are huge numbers. But it's not just about numbers of species. The sheer volume of wild creatures and ecosystems are actually declining. The biomass of the world's vegetation declined by 50% over human history, and forests now span only 68% of their pre-industrial extent. We all know why. And similarly, global biomass of wild mammals is now less than 25% of that before the latest mass extinction. And this last statement is not surprising when you contemplate the fact that 96% of all mammals are comprised of either humans or our domesticated livestock. Now, some fundamental functions that nature provides are often not even obvious to most of us. And that's why IPBES uses the following three categories that you can see here to classify and assess the impacts of biodiversity loss and the consequences for people. They talk about nature as contributing materials and assistance, regulating the environmental processes, and also providing non-material contributions. And this table here shows the directional trends of each of the contribution types over the last 50 years. And you can see that material contributions are the only ones that are pointing up. I've circled them in red there. And since the 70s, production of bioenergy, food, feed, fiber, all materials essentially, have increased. And in fact, the value of agricultural crop production has tripled since the 70s. But agricultural forestry, bioenergy production, fisheries, aquaculture, none of these would exist if it were not for a number of supporting services, like pollination or regulation of pests or water control or soil formation. Yet about 80% of these contributions to nature makes to humans have declined. And you can see that across all the other rows in this table, the arrows are pointing downwards. Now, as an example of all the wildlife we take for granted because their function is largely hidden from us, we can take insects. More than 75% of global food crop types, and that includes many of our fruits and vegetables and some of the most important cash crops like coffee and cocoa, they rely on animal pollination. And of course, insects are also fundamental to crop pest control. But insect populations are declining dramatically. I'm sure you've heard about it. So it's not just numbers of species, but it's also in volume. Now in Germany, as an example, there's been a 75% decline in total flying insect biomass over the last 27 years. And this worrying trend has even been given its own name. It's called the windshield phenomena, because nowadays insect carcasses on windscreens are no longer a problem. Many of you my age will remember driving through the countryside and having your windscreen look like that. It doesn't happen anymore. And IPBES estimates that between 230 and 570 some billion US dollars in annual global crop output is at risk as a result of this kind of pollinator loss. So it's obvious, and I think no surprise to anyone, that extractive sectors are big drivers of biodiversity loss. But I think it would be a little bit simplistic and lopsided to pin it all on those sectors, when in fact, many manufacturing and service sectors have embedded biodiversity loss in their supply chains because of the resources that are used as input technology or material. So I would say that a lack of internalization of externalities is a fundamental general driver of biodiversity loss. And it is a key challenge for all of society to deal with. And just like Scope 3 has become a means to conceptualize and hopefully address greenhouse gas emissions beyond the reporting organization, I think we really need to try and find ways to assess embedded biodiversity loss across supply chains as well. Now, I've described what biodiversity is, how we depend on it, and I've tried to provide some of the most recent facts and trends about the situation. But concretely then, as investors, what is the risk of large-scale biodiversity loss to you? Well, the conventional notion of risk in finance is concerned with direct financial risks to businesses and therefore to investors. But the bulk of this talk has been about the negative externalities of economic activities and of investments. And these impacts contribute to what I will call aggravation risk. And by that, I mean that they aggravate pressures on the living planet, which translates into risks for finance. Generally, they're not captured in most financial risk frameworks, focusing, as I said, on risk to companies and investors. But we can think of these externalities translating into material risk at two levels. The first, the externalities resulting in biodiversity loss that's created by one company can actually affect the biophysical risks to which that same company's operations are directly exposed. I've tried to illustrate that with a red circular arrow there in the corner. But a second level goes beyond the risks that are incurred by individual companies or sectors. And these are risks that are more systemic in nature, and they stem from the fact that biodiversity is strongly and directly connected to climate by virtue of determining which ecosystems exist where and how well they recycle moisture and capture and store carbon. So I thought I'd give you an example. Using forests, again, they store large amounts of carbon in their biomass. And taking the example of the Amazon, which I'm very familiar with, and I think probably you are too. This is a rainforest. It gets 50% of its moisture from air circulation, but it also produces the other 50% on its own through the trees breathing. And as we diminish biodiversity by, for example, deforesting, this affects the ability of the forest ecosystem to sustain itself in the face of stressors and shocks. And in the case of the Amazon, we're already seeing by climate change hitting it and having droughts, for example. The Amazon then loses its capacity to recycle the moisture that it needs. It starts to dry out, and eventually there's a point at which it tips into a different ecosystem, a savanna, which is much drier, burns more frequently, and it stores, importantly, much less carbon. And it means that biodiversity loss affects, yes, the forest's ability to function locally as a habitat for plant and animals, but also as a global carbon sink. And the reduced capacity of the Amazon to recycle moisture also has effect on regional rainfall patterns. And so it's affecting the potential of South American rain-fed agriculture in this entire region. And it even affects global moisture recycling and rainfall in Central Africa. So by virtue of affecting rain in this way, it influences what and how much you can grow, and therefore the carbon storage capacity of ecosystems that go far beyond the Brazilian border. So here's a clear example of how biodiversity, land cover, moisture recycling, and climate are all interconnected. And from this, I hope that it's clear that biodiversity is directly linked to our ability to halt and deal with climate change. So back to this risk loop before I hand over to Gustav and them. Biodiversity will affect how well we cope and adapt with climate change. It's a key insurance mechanism in staving off the worst effects of climate change. And loss of that insurance function through externalities of economic investments will increase systemic risks, because it translates into impacts on entire sectors like the rain-fed agriculture that I gave the example of, or entire markets through damage to infrastructure and fixed capital, but also through massive disruptions to supply chains and loss of human capital, for example, through pandemics, which I haven't gotten into here. But with that image in mind, I want to now hand over to my colleagues from the Beijer Institute of Ecological Economics, Gustav and Johan, and they'll demonstrate these network effects in economic terms, and using this brand new interactive tool that makes integrated assessment models more accessible and transparent. And I hope they will show how biodiversity and climate interact to affect multiple real economy outcomes and sectors, and give us an example of how green investments can also affect this. So over to you, Johan.
Yes, thank you, Bea. So like Bea said, me and Gustav are economists, doing mostly macroeconomics and researching the kind of the two-way interaction between the global economy and the environment that the economy is embedded in. So what we're typically interested in when we're doing this modeling is to think about how the market forces determine the use of inputs, such as, in the typical economic model, labor and capital, and in our settings we usually have energy and land and those types of things, to focus more on kind of the environmental side of the issue. And another type of thinking is what types of thinking can improve on the market outcome. For instance, if there are these kind of external effects, and by that we mean third-party effects. So if people not involved in market transactions are affected by those market transactions, for instance, by environmental externalities, we don't expect the market outcome to account for those effects properly. And a typical result that we would get from these type of analysis is that when you look at the issue of climate change, we find very strong support for implementing some kind of carbon taxes or tradable emission permits to reduce emissions beyond what the market otherwise would give. Yes. Good. But when you study the economy, you have to realize that the whole economy is a connected system, and any change that you do to any part of the economy basically ripples through the entire economy. Your
sound is breaking up a little bit.
Okay. Should I? How far should I?
Better now. Yeah.
I think it might be necessary to turn your camera off, Johan. I think just to get better sound. I'm sorry. We want to see you, but thanks.
Yeah, no problem. Can I start from this slide, or should I go back further?
I think you can continue here. And I think when you lean towards your computer, I think it was better. I don't know. Extra.
Okay. Yes, I'll try. So does it work better now? Or?
Yes, this is better.
Okay, good. Yes. So when you think about kind of anything that happens in the economy, you have to kind of realize that the economy is a connected system, and anything you do will kind of ripple through the system via capital markets, labor markets, goods markets, etc. So the end effect of any kind of change that you consider will be the net effect of many different changes along these kind of chain reactions that we have. So to deal with this, we need something called general equilibrium model, which precisely deals with this. That you have to think about what is the net effect of everything that's triggered by one change somewhere in the economy. And this is very commonly used in this context. For instance, when it comes to environmental economics and environmental policy, we have a model called EMEC that's developed and used by the National Institute of Economic Research. So that's the Konjunkturinstitutet in Swedish. And but this kind of method of analysis requires some technical knowledge about how it works. So in order to make this more accessible, we hope to more people to be able to use this to think about these issues, we are developing a modeling and visualization tool that we call Valras that Gustav will demonstrate shortly. And what we'll use it for here is to analyze the issue of climate change and biodiversity jointly. And we will, among other things, consider one kind of intervention or policy or what you can that boils down to increasing the cost of capital in the fossil energy sector. So we can think about that as kind of investment criteria that steers investments away from the fossil energy sector, making it more costly to raise capital for fossil investments, basically. So what you're going to see is definitely a simplified model, but the main conclusions are robust to more detailed settings. And this also is very closely related to work that we published last year in Nature Communications together with some other co-authors as well. Yes, so with this I leave to Gustav to demonstrate the model.
Thank you, Johan.
So there we go. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Good. So our inspiration here when constructing Valras actually came from network graphs. And the idea was that these graphs can kind of provide us with a quick overview of both what goes into an economic model, but also with regards to kind of the direction and flows of resources in the economy. And as Johan said, the idea now is to kind of go through a stylized modeling exercise to kind of show you how market forces and environmental actions can lead to unintended outcomes despite well-intended policy. So the model here is kind of a standard economic model featuring the typical components.
Your sound is not there anymore, sorry.
Okay. Now?
Yeah, now it's better, yeah, thanks.
How long have you missed?
Just the last sentence.
Okay, so so the model here is it's just a standard economic model. It features households, it features firms, it features a bunch of resources being used and distributed across the economy. And the model has been aggregated into three basic sectors. So we have an agricultural sector, we have a fossil fuel energy sector, and we have industry capturing basically everything else that goes on in the economy. And as Johan said, the model is a general equilibrium model. That means that we're essentially considering the economy as a whole rather than any individual markets. And that implies that we have to specify a bunch of other things, such as ownerships in the economy, who owns what, the consumption streams. We need to specify taxes and transfers flowing in and out of the government. And so this description kind of completes an economic model here, if you will. And the idea now is to kind of connect this economic model to the environmental aspects, such as here we're going to consider biodiversity and climate change. And the way we think about this in economics terms is, as Johan said, in terms of externalities. And so these are simply third-party effects, external effects from the economy to the environment, and then back onto the economy. So that completes essentially the full description of our economy. And the idea now is we're going to start out from a baseline setting, which is going to be what is usually referred to by integrated assessment models as kind of pre-industrial state. By that, we mean that the economy is essentially embedded in the environment. It depends on the environment, but it has no kind of real impacts on large-scale global biophysical processes such as climate change and biodiversity. So it's a kind of baseline to start out our analysis from. And the model here is pre-calibrated for the sake of this session. So I'm simply going to click run here in Valras. And as you can see here, it kind of quickly computes the equilibrium outcome here. You can see the input shares, or kind of the cost shares, how they are distributed across various sectors. You see how the different quantities in the economy, how they get distributed. And you also see profits to the households where they are gained from, basically profits from ownership of the various resources here. All right, so moving from pre-industrial to today's world, where the situation is different. Now we have a situation where not only is the economy affected by its environment, but it also has substantial impacts on these global biophysical processes such as climate change and biodiversity. So in order to do that, I'm going to add in these external effects. There's going to be an effect of fossil fuel energy consumption on climate change. So you can think about climate change variable here essentially as the global mean temperature. So as fossil fuel production increases, the global mean temperature also tends to increase. And also we have this interaction from land use in agriculture. So the expansion of farmland typically is bad for biodiversity. So it leads to decline. So having done that, I can just run the model here in Valras and I can see how the results are computed. Yeah. But here we're interested in kind of comparing the results to our previous settings when we were in pre-industrial state. So here I can pick up the pre-industrial equilibrium outcome, and we can see this in this right-hand column. And we can compare the outcomes to the current results, which were computed with externalities. So first of all, we might want to look at how our environmental variables have responded to this current scenario. So here we see, for example, when it comes to climate change, that is a global mean temperature, it has increased as a result of this. And also looking at biodiversity, we here see a decline in biodiversity, which very much corresponds to kind of our current move from pre-industrial to today's world. However, as Johan alluded to, kind of the economy is responsive and responds in various ways to this change in our settings. And we can see, for example, in the with regards to production levels in industry here, we see that they have declined. We see also production levels in agriculture has also declined due to kind of these damages resulting from our environmental factors here influencing us. But the economy doesn't only respond in terms of how much it outputs it, but it also responds in terms of how it uses its inputs. And we can see that, for example, here for farmland, we see how the agricultural sector starts to use more farmland, and fossil fuel energy consumption is also increased. And this is essentially a response to kind of the productivity loss occurring from these environmental damages. All right, this was the comparison between the pre-industrial to today's world. And now the question, of course, is how can we apply different policies to kind of amend this current situation that we're in? And given that a lot of you are in the investment fund management industry, we thought it would be interesting to kind of consider a scenario where you, for some reasons, such as a sustainability criteria, start to shy away from investments in the fossil fuel energy industry. And this, as Johan said, would essentially imply that capital costs would increase in the sector. And we can capture this kind of scenario, kind of proxy this scenario in Valras by essentially imposing a capital tax here in the fossil fuel energy sector, which would clearly increase the cost here. So I updated that value, and I can now simply run the model here in Valras, see the new equilibrium outcome. And then let's compare the results then to our previous scenario, which was the externalities only scenario, but with no policy. So first of all, having imposed this tax on capital in the fossil fuel energy sector, we want to see how it responds to this capital tax. And as you see here, production levels in the fossil fuel energy sector has fallen as a result of this, which would be something that you would expect. Now, next, let's see what the implications were for the environment. Here we see how the global mean temperature has declined as a result of this policy, which would also be something that you might expect. And you can also see a slight improvement in biodiversity here, although it's very, very small. Now, a question you might ask at this stage is, okay, so fine, this seems to work for climate change, but it doesn't do all that much for biodiversity. So how could we further improve the situation for biodiversity? And this kind of general equilibrium calculation can actually inform you regarding this type of decision. So if you look at how the economy has responded to this capital tax, you can see, for example, how the factory inputs have changed here as well. And one thing that you immediately recognize looking at these figures is how farmland, for example, has responded. And here you can see, as a result of this increase in the cost of using fossil fuel energy, farmers start to increase their use of farmland. So essentially what's happened here is that the relative price of farmland has fallen in relation to fossil fuel energy use. So that might give you a hint that we should kind of try to target farmland in some way if we are to kind of improve further the situation for biodiversity. And we can proxy this kind of policy in, once again, in Walras, just applying a simple input tax. But actually, this could be a policy that would kind of correspond to any other type of restraint on farmland. Right, so I'll update that value. I'll run the model in this case. You can see that the results are being computed. We can now compare the results in this scenario. So I'm loading up the equilibrium outcome for the capital energy tax. And first of all, let's see how farmland has responded here. And here you can see how farmland has actually declined as a result of this tax, which would be something that, of course, you might expect as the tax increases here. And next, let's look at our target variable, namely biodiversity. And here you can see quite a substantial increase now in biodiversity, at least in comparison to the previous increase. So this seems to have worked out for the better, but we might also want to look at other parts of the economy, in particular also our other environmental variables, if we're going to think about how this has played out. And here you can see, for example, how climate change also has responded as a result to this increase this reduction in farmland, which has made fossil fuel energy more competitive. All right, so basically this completes what I wanted to say with regards to our model, and I hope you thought it was useful to you. And to summarize, I could just say that this, has been a quick overview of a complex set of economic interactions or feedback loop, and I hopefully you feel that this kind of visualization tool can be useful for you when you want to analyze these types of interactions. So yeah, that's all for me, and I pass over to Beatrice.
Gustav, can I jump in with a question from the audience, which is related, sorry, Beatrice, to the Walras? Maybe it's easy to take it. It's about how could individual companies use Walras to understand their own externalities and how it affects their operations, or is Walras only used to inform on a sector level?
It's primarily used to kind of inform on a sector level. You know, it's like a macroeconomic tool. This is the way these types of models are typically used. However, if you're considering an investment strategy targeted at some specific sector or specific resource, you might want to, although you feel that your investment is perhaps small in relation to the entire economy, you still might want to see that the direction of your investment also makes improvements in other parts of the economy or other environmental factors apart from the one that you're specifically targeting, at least knowing that you're moving in the right direction and there aren't any kind of bad trade-offs in terms of other environmental issues that are being caused by your investment strategy. That's what I could say about that.
Thank you. And could you also see risks for the sector then and potential effects by risks?
Well, I mean, there's no specific uncertainty in here, but of course you can, I mean, what this kind of modeling exercise shows you is kind of second order effects or third order effects that might occur. So potential risk that you might want to take into your calculus when thinking over your strategy.
So I'll just take one more question on the model. I think it's better to have it in relation to this. And it's when setting up the model, where are the coefficients derived from? For example, fossil fuels go up, climate tends to warm as well. But where do you source the coefficient that you typed in?
Okay, so so in general, what you do is, I mean, in these types of models, is you might rely on other empirical analysis that had previously been done, other research showing you what relation between two specific variables tends to look like, and you use parameters from other research that has been done. Also, you might another alternative might be to kind of calibrate your model parameters using data on variables during a specific state of the economy and environmental interaction. So various sources, I would say, various ways of doing this.
Thank you. And now, Beatrice, please.
Okay, Gustav, I'll ask you to stop sharing.
Okay, so see if I can do that.
But yeah, I think what Gustav and Johan nicely illustrate with walrus is that biodiversity and climate change have these combined effects on our economy. Gustav talks about them as second and third order. And to me, also in response to the question, that is what the risk is. You see this rippling through the system. It's an exemplification of, you know, the systemic effects, whether they're always a risk or not. It's kind of up to you as an investor, I suppose. I think it also shows that green investments designed to reduce fossil fuel emissions, for example, can have important positive impacts, but could also run a risk of inadvertently undermining biodiversity if, for example, you know, they're funneled into a large-scale development of bioenergy plantations or afforestation of non-forest ecosystems without keeping track.
We cannot see your slides. It's just
that's
white.
Fine. I don't have anything. It's
okay,
just
great.
white.
Sorry.
Just you know, without keeping track of what those kinds of large-scale actions do to biodiversity and ecosystem function. So, because for example, I think in the near future, I'm convinced that we're going to see a flood of initiatives and business proposals to address either climate change or biodiversity, for example. And in that context, I think it will be absolutely instrumental that investors are aware of some of these rather well-known trade-offs, and try to look to those to understand, you know, how investment practices will play out. Where can you have strong co-benefits when you're investing capital and directing capital to those? And so now that's why I'm flagging this IPCC IPBES report again, because in this you'll have a long list of sort of these trade-offs, but also these win-wins. And I think we didn't have time to get into that in this presentation, but I highly recommend it. It's fairly easy reading. So I was going to say something more, but I think we're running out of time. So I'm going to stop there and hand it back to you, Åsa.
You can finalize, Beatrice. I just pushed in some questions beforehand. So finalize your presentation. That's good.
Okay, well, I think I was just going to really say something more general about sort of what are we seeing then? What's happening in this space? And I know we'll be hearing more about some specific initiatives today. But as a quick scan, we can see that, for example, green sustainable investments are on the rise. You all know that. Global Sustainable Investment Alliance reports $35.3 trillion US being invested under some form of ESG flag in 2020, which is a 15% increase, up from, well, actually down from 34% increase in the previous 2 years. But I think it's interesting to just, before I leave you, reflect on what are these ESG investments as reported by the Global Sustainable Investment Alliance, for example, because they cite $35.3 trillion US. And that's all equity investments in 5 major markets that are in any way associated with either screening or any type of loosely defined ESG integration, sustainability themed, or what I would call impact investments, and engagement and shareholder action. And so I wanted to just reflect on 2 of these, because taken together, this this list here stretches sustainable investments to include a vast array of investment strategies with very different capacities to actually promote sustainability or promote biodiversity, for example. And if you look at engagement and shareholder action highlighted there, it's certainly an important mechanism for promoting change, but as a measure of whether an investment is actually sustainable, I think it is problematic because it's a measure that captures process, not outcome. And when it works, it can lead to significant improvements. But we've also seen in history time and time again, institutional investors engaging, yet company practices not shifting. And so I think we need to be aware that when we're labeling investments as green or on the basis of them being associated with, for example, active ownership, it is a potential large overestimation. And also, before I finish, short note on screening, because this can be super effective in weeding out the worst corporate practices. But I think it's important that we don't lose sight of the fact that it remains a relative measure, and having the best-in-class company for deforestation in your portfolio may reduce deforestation rates for sure, but the aggregate amount of forest loss still stacks up. And if that deforestation and biodiversity loss is happening in an area that it's, in the same area or in an area that's approaching a tipping point like the Amazon, there's a finite limit, and it doesn't really matter beyond which it's whether it's the least bad company that is doing that deforesting. So my final point was just here that without a clear benchmark against which to judge actual negative and positive contributions of companies to a particular externality, whether it's carbon or deforestation area or biodiversity, these relative measures are just not going to be enough to shift trajectories. So that's why I'm looking forward also to the second webinar in this series, where we're going to be looking at some more specifically biodiversity impact metrics being developed. And with that, I do want to finish. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Beatrice, and Gustav and Johan as well. Very interesting, both quantitative and qualitative information and some new perspectives. And biodiversity is already gaining increasing interest from the finance sector, as we all know. And as a major actor for responsible investment, PRI are doing a lot on this topic. And Gemma James will give a presentation of a selection of activities and initiatives. So please, Gemma.
Thanks, Åsa, and good morning, everybody, and thank you for the invitation for coming to join the discussion today. So I'm the biodiversity lead at PRI, and hopefully most of you know us at PRI, so I won't introduce us, but as an organisation, we do look at financial markets and the system more broadly, and whether that's sustainable finance policy, integration of ESG practices, stewardship, and then also these very specific ESG topics, including climate change, social and governance issues, and also nature. So at PRI, we have an internal nature strategy, and our main focus has been on biodiversity and deforestation to date. Just on biodiversity, in the past year, we have published a discussion paper on investor action on biodiversity, and we also recently conducted a survey with signatories and data providers on what biodiversity and data investors actually require, what data and approaches are available to them, and then what are the gaps in between. I'm just going to focus though on the sort of few activities we have coming up and on what's ongoing, and that's going to cover nature more broadly and biodiversity, and these are the ones that are on the slide for you now. So the first one is around establishing principles for investing in nature, and this is very early stages, but we're looking at developing a set of high integrity, high level principles aligned with our own principles, but for nature. And by investing for nature, or investing in nature, I mean any investment that has an impact or a dependency on nature through direct operations or supply chains or products. It could also include investments that aim to have a positive impact on nature, such as new products, services, and technologies, and also direct investments, such as through conservation projects. So we're looking at a set of principles that apply to all investments and asset classes with a link to nature. So not just those that are stating they are a sustainable investment. Before we even discuss the principles themselves, though, we do need to align and define what those principles will be aiming for. So for PRI, our internal strategy is set around nature's recovery, stability, and resilience. but we are wanting to test this framing first, so there will be an opportunity to engage with us as a starting point on these principles there. The second piece is around exploring a biome approach, and we're doing this in collaboration with UNEP WCMC. Before I even explain what the project is, just to explain the rationale for exploring a biome approach. We know that impacts on nature play out locally and they're very contextual. Unlike carbon, we know that nature is far more complex to account for, and it's harder to identify what the dependencies and impacts are on nature. And back in May, we released maps of natural capital hotspots of depletion with UNEP WCMC. And now we're working together to see if we can develop a proof of concept to do an analysis of the risks associated with the impacts and dependencies of sectors and companies operating in or sourcing from a specific biome or region. So effectively, we're looking at a proof of concept for what would the methodology be to better understand natural capital depletion at a more granular scale. How can we obtain asset level data for a particular region and assess that sector's impacts and dependencies on ecosystem services? So we're going to explore how we could do this first for the Cerrado in Brazil, looking at the cattle and soy production there. And we've chosen the Cerrado to pilot as we already have some work around deforestation in the region. So this is a longer term project, but again, we hope to be able to test with investors once we have something to share on that. And then the final piece, so this is the easiest one to explain. We have two informal reference groups, one for asset owners and one for investment managers, that are both co-hosted with UNEP FI. And the groups are voluntary, there are no commitments and are a little bit ad hoc, but they are a space for signatories to come together to discuss issues, challenges, or anything on biodiversity, really. The asset owner group started with metrics on biodiversity, and the asset managers wanted to focus on stewardship. More recently, though, both groups have actually come together and they've had joint calls. So we had one with the team that did the Disruptor review, and also with IUCN on their guidelines on how corporates should plan and monitor biodiversity. And we're planning for the next call to be with the cross-sector biodiversity initiative, which is focusing on the extractive industry and the equator principal banks on how they're applying the mitigation hierarchy. So also, I think that's my 5 minutes. I'll hand back to you.
Yes, thank you. Many things happening. And just a quick, if anyone is interested in joining a group or learning more, I guess there's more information on the website to contact. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's probably best just to contact myself. We haven't, definitely the first two are not on the website, and the informal reference groups are very informal. So please do reach out if you'd like to join those.
Great. Thanks a lot, Gemma. And another organization taking early action in the area is Finance for Biodiversity Pledge. And Anne-Marie Bohr is here to introduce us to their work. Please, Anne-Marie.
Thanks a lot for inviting me to speak about Finance for Biodiversity Pledge and Foundation. I'm very happy to meet you all. I was noticing Anita Lindberg also in the room. I was in Sweden in 2019, just before the whole COVID started, and also discussing biodiversity within Swesif. So great to be part of this webinar, and I'm enjoying also the presentations. The Finance for Biodiversity Pledge was launched last year, September, so we're almost 1 year old. It's, next slide, please. It's a commitment by financial institutions, so they're committing themselves, it's a public statement, public commitment, committing themselves to collaborating and sharing knowledge, engaging with companies, assess impact, set targets, and report publicly. But not only committing to take action themselves, but also, and that's how it started, a call on global leaders for an ambitious, globally agreed biodiversity goal. So to really have a high outcome of the COP15, which now will take place in April, May. And we would like the new global biodiversity framework to aim for reversing nature loss in this decade, but specifically also to have the finance sector being part of this globally agreed goal and targets. At the moment, it's targeting business, but finance in itself is not included. So we're also a collaborative voice to have that heard. Next slide, please. So now we're having 55 signatories. There's more coming up. We're having a next celebration next week, the 22nd September. So we might be passing the amount of 70, or the number. So here you can see from Sweden, Swedbank Robur has joined, and we are in touch with some others as well with interest. It's a mix of banks, asset managers, insurers, and also a few public banks and one pension fund so far, a Danish one, PKA. Next slide, please. So early this year, we also started to set up further collaboration. The members felt a need to further collaborate, so not only stating the action and calling on global leaders, but also to actively collaborate together. So we've started with 3 working groups, setting up a foundation, so signatories can become a member of the foundation and collaborate in 3 working groups. There's one working group, engagement with companies. This group is also looking into setting up a Nature Action 100. But next to that, they're also making an inventory of all collaborative engagement initiatives that are out there. Yesterday, for example, we had as a guest speaker the Institute for Environmental Health network from the USA looking into chemical footprinting. Another working group is looking into impact assessment, comparing the tools that are out there at the moment to measure impact also at portfolio level. So over there, we're also sharing experiences with the different tools. And also there's a subgroup looking into data and linking the science with how data is captured by the tools that are in use at the moment, and also the requirements from the legal perspective. And then there's a third group, public policy advocacy. And over here at the moment, we're targeting on the COP15. So we're the only organization so far that has been accredited by the Convention on Biological Diversity, the only finance sector organization, I should say, that can have a speaking voice as part of the CBD negotiations. And then the speaking voice has to be supported by a government, and then it can be included in the whole negotiation process. But we're also linking up with those governments, of course. I'll answer the question a couple of minutes later. So yeah, that's what we're doing at the moment. And next year we'll be setting up a working group on target setting and most likely positive impact as well. Next slide, please. So we've also made an overview of initiatives in collaboration with the PRI and UNEP-FI. This is just to show that the overview is there. You can look it up on the website, and I can provide some web links later on in the chat as well. So just to clarify on what initiatives are out there, how to get in touch with them, and what their focus is. Next slide, please. We made some other publications as well. So together with the pledge, we made a guidance document describing what the commitments mean, but also providing some examples of how some financial institutions are at the moment working on this. And also we've made a guide on the 6 measurement tools that are out there at the moment that financial institutions can use to measure their impact. We're comparing the tool, provides to give an overview of what is included and what is not included, and also give some information on the level of maturity. And another publication we've been collaborating on together with the PRI as well, Business for Nature and UNEP-FI and the CBD Secretariat, is to provide some background information on how it all works with the CBD process and how the financial sector can engage. And the next slide will be on questions, but I think that will be after the 3. Shall I then answer the question on TNFD, maybe after TNFD presentation?
Yes, we can come back to
Perfect.
that one.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna-Marie. Thank you very much. And related to that question on connection with the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures, now we will hear a little bit about this initiative as well. This development has been supported by 4 founding partner organizations where WWF is one. And Magnus and Fel will now tell us more about the task force. Please, Magnus.
Thank you and good morning. Thanks for this opportunity. I hope you can see my slides.
Yes, we can. You're a little bit low on the sound. Don't know if you can...
Okay, I have a headset and mic in front. Try to speak low. That's what I can do. Please turn up your speaker.
Yeah, thanks.
So yeah, as mentioned, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure has been initiated by 4 organizations, Global Canopy, UNEP, FI, and UNDP, together with WWF, and with support from the Global Environment Facility. We've been working, and I was part of this work representing WWF until March this year, and it's now been launched in June. But before that, it was a informal working group with 74 different organizations, mainly from the financial sector, but also from corporates and from governments, but also organizations like the PRI, World Economic Forum, and others who participated in shaping this initiative. And it was led by 3 co-chairs from the industry, from Banorte, Mexico, BNP Paribas, France, and Green Finance Institute, who represented then the members. And what we did was producing a plan, a work plan, and a strategy and a structure for the task force itself, with different components, as you can imagine, but where we also wordsmithed and discussed and shared with all the stakeholders what the goal should be of the TNFD. So as you read here, the goal of the TNFD is to provide a framework for organizations to report and act on evolving nature-related risks in order to support a shift in global financial flows away from nature-negative outcomes and toward nature-positive outcomes. This was also complemented by an informal technical working group who produced a proposed technical scope for what this disclosure framework should be. It's just a summary of it, saying that it should include a governance for working on biodiversity disclosure, the strategy and how the strategy is impacted by biodiversity loss and opportunities, and the risk management, how those risks and opportunities are addressed, and of course at the core, a development of metrics and targets for this. And for all these pillars, the disclosure should include both the impacts on nature, dependence on nature, and the resulting financial risks and opportunities from it. There is more detailed scope if you want to take part of it on the tnfd.info website, where is more proposals for how to address this more in detail, the scope and technical considerations, so which I invite you to take a look at, but there's not room to go into that in this presentation, I'm afraid. The task force will be set up like this, with 2 co-chairs, with a secretariat, and with a group of 30 members from the corporate sector, financial sector, and some financial service providers. And they will be working in different working groups, and there will be a wider opportunity to follow this and contribute from a wider stakeholder group. In the stewardship group, there will be the founding organizations together with funders. And already now, since the launch, the TNFD was formally launched in June, 10th of June. And at that point, there was an announcement of the 2 co-chairs, which is David Craig, previously from Refinitiv and London Stock Exchange, together with Elizabeth Baruma Mrema, who is the Secretary General of the CBD Convention, the Convention on Biodiversity for UN. So that's a very has been a lot of considerations to getting this combination of the industry and the biodiversity into the chairmanship of this initiative. And just a couple of days ago, it was also announced that the Green Finance Institute will be hosting the secretariat, and there's been an executive director appointed for the secretariat, Tony Goldner, who has a background from Deloitte and also as an advisor to the World Bank. I'm going to mention here as well that the members, the task force members, the 30 ones, will be announced and appointed by the end of September now, so that the task force can get to work. And the work plan looks in an overview like this, that we have now passed the phase 0 and we have established a task force, the TNFD, and the first phase now is to build this framework, test it together with all the experts, stakeholders and members involved, and then put it out for consultation. And once it's finalized, and then we are in 2023, it will be disseminated, and the continued work will be for the uptake of it. This is a very similar process as you may have see to the TCFD, and there's been a lot of contacts and exchange and lessons learned with the TCFD Secretariat to make sure that this is sort of building and complementing on that process, and that we can not reinvent the wheel too much here. So I will leave with just some endorsements from different parts of the world, and invite you to learn more from the tnfd.info website on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Magnus. So now I think we all feel that we got a lot of information on this complex and important issue, and now we're gonna try to have some discussion and ask more of the questions from you in the audience. I see that there's also been some answers provided already also in the chat, so you can have a look there as well. But I'll start off with just one question for each of you short. I think I could maybe start with Beatrice, I was wondering, what do you think from your perspective are like greatest opportunities or greatest threats with this rapid development and many initiatives by the financial sector to address biodiversity issues?
Well, first of all, I think that it's really welcome, and it's exciting and reassuring to see this sudden interest from the investment community. So I guess the opportunity, you've seen it, you know, the opportunity is to safeguard a lot of the things, nature, the planet that we live on, and our economies and the financial sector in the future. So that's the opportunity, and that's what we have to do it. Threats, I think, to me as a scientist, and I'm not as well informed now, I will be better informed for the next webinar, but there is a flurry of activities geared at trying to measure impact. My concern, as I think Gemma noted this and others, biodiversity and its interaction with, you know, forest, ecosystem, and like, it's complex. And therefore my concern is that we're starting to see metrics that are not well grounded in the science, that are not actually, you can come up with lots of different metrics, but are they meaningful proxies of what we are trying to measure? That's my biggest concern at the moment.
Yes, thank you. And we will talk about the next webinar a bit at the end of this one as well. So Gemma, maybe a little bit related to this, PRI has chosen to talk about nature resilience rather than nature positive. Why is that important to you?
Thanks also. So maybe a few reasons here. And I'm going to caveat my answer with, you know, we're testing the terminology. So we're not sold on the term resilience, but we do believe in the concept very much. And we need to find a good way of communicating it. So if I take nature positive first, I think nature positive can be interpreted very differently depending on who's talking about it. So yes, it's a very catchy term that's gained some traction. But what is nature positive? If we took 5 people from the audience and asked you to give us a definition each, I wonder, like, would we get the same definition each time? And I had to Google nature positive, and I read a couple of blogs. So what I discovered nature positive is, you know, we need to halt the loss of nature from now. We need to increase the health of nature by 2030, and we need the recovery of nature by 2050. And that's great, like, completely agree with those outcomes. But then we just focus on the word positive. So you're almost missing the fact that we need to halt the loss of nature component. And it just doesn't reflect the stages of the mitigation hierarchy, where even if you're aiming for net gain or net positive, you have to avoid and minimize any negative impact first. Otherwise, we end up with unintended consequences. And Beatrice actually said that in her presentation too. Then if I think about the resilience of nature, or nature resilience, for us that means that nature is able to recover from stress and disturbance. It can retain its essential functions, the structure, all of the feedback loops. And we want to see nature having this capacity to deal with the stress and the shocks and pressures that us as humans place on the environment, so that we can stay within these planetary boundaries. And when we did a literature review, and that included looking at the Global Biodiversity Framework draft, which I know is not agreed yet, but the pathways all seem to be heading towards resilience. So, you know, to get to resilience, you have to go through those 3 steps that I highlighted under Nature Positive, but maybe the term resilience itself might test investors on, you know, how are we going to apply it. We talk about resilient portfolios, diversified portfolios, talk about the resilience in the context of climate change. What does it mean for society to adapt to hazards over time? And, you know, we don't want others to think, oh, that ecosystem is resilient, so we can divert all of our pressures to that ecosystem away from those that are less resilient. That's not what we're trying to get to. So we do need to socialise the term. We don't have to call it resilience, but we do want to make sure we have maintaining, functioning, healthy ecosystems for the long term. So we're open to the debate, and I'd love to hear what Beatrice thinks as well, given resilience is in the name of the organisation.
Thank you, Gemma. Beatrice, do you want to say something on that?
No, I think Gemma captures it well, and I think it's also really interesting that PRI, as a big and influential organization in this domain, is starting to use that concept. I share with you that resilience can sometimes be confusing and has many different definitions depending on who you talk to, but I think the way that you defined it is essentially the way that we think about it, and it's how I try to portray it in my presentation. Resilience is a means of the planet ecosystems to cope with what is coming. We know it is coming, we just don't know exactly what is coming, and it's that uncertainty that we want to stand sort of well prepared for, and that's where resilience comes in.
Great, thanks. So Anna-Marie, I'll give you a tough one. I was wondering, from your perspective, what one action from an asset manager or asset owner would you say would have the most positive impact for biodiversity at this stage? What can you actually do?
Yes, well, I think one important action is to start measuring, although the methods are not perfect yet, but just start measuring it. And then you'll have a combination of both positive impact, but mostly negative impact at the moment. ASN Bank has been leading in this way, for example. They set a target themselves to be nature positive or beyond reversing nature loss in 2030, and they started to measure also at portfolio level. So that gains deeper understanding to them, but also to look into projects, engagements, to enable positive impact as well. I know there are projects with 1 year attention for biodiversity insects, for example, and they had an increase of 70% in just 1 year. So it can be done, but it's also another mind shift you need for companies. So that's, points you can engage on, but just start with measuring. I think that will be a first good step. So happy to hear this will be the topic of your next webinar. And I can include the link to the guide that has been made. We're updating it on a quarterly basis.
Actually, 2 of those tools will also be presented at the next webinar. So
great.
Thank you. So Magnus, I have one question starting up for you as well. As TNFD is building further on TCFD, I was wondering if you see that there can be a risk of mimicking activities and processes related to climate too much, and that the challenge of biodiversity needs other action, or how do you see that?
So it's not built on the TCFD, it's initiated separately, but we have had close contacts with the TCFD Secretariat all the way to learn from them, because it's been, I think we can all agree that TCFD before and we have deliberately chosen TNFD because you will recognize the abbreviation. So before we had a TCFD, we didn't really know, and when it came, at least I wanted TC what. So the notion of having this kind of task force, but also the idea about developing this kind of reporting framework, and from a new kind of purpose that hasn't really been standard practice before. That's what we are trying to build on and trying to replicate. When it comes to the actual measurement and reporting metrics and the actions you need to take, they will often be quite different when it comes to biodiversity, just given the nature of very local or a very diverse kind of impacts or dependencies that you have, compared to how we are all affecting the climate, but it's much more abstract in a way. So there is a lot to learn, a lot to build from, and we hear it clearly. We heard it from the Informal Working Group, we hear it from others that we shouldn't invent a completely different reporting framework, which creates just an increased reporting burden for everyone, but it needs to be something which is meaningful and useful and can be effectively used and implemented in the organizations, the investors and corporates who are going to use it.
Thank you. Yeah, that sounds good. So looking into the questions from the audience now, there is one question also asking if you are familiar with the EU disclosure requirements and the draft principal adverse indicators. Do you have a view on which of the biodiversity related voluntary indicators might be most important to focus on at this stage? I don't know, Beatrice, are you aware of them? No. So someone else who have an opinion on this? I think maybe the question was for you, Beatrice, but
yeah, I think I responded to Katrine, or I forget the name now, but yeah, that okay. I'm not read up on it yet. That is on my to-do list, because I think it's really important to get a scientific sort of scrutiny of these. And I'm with Anne-Marie Bohr in that you know, we can't wait till we have perfect measures of biodiversity. We won't get them anytime soon. But I also think that it's important to have a sort of vetting of these reporting requirements, for example, to see. But I can't answer the question now, so I'll happily leave to one of the others.
Oh, yes. So anybody else who has a comment? Yes, Anne-Marie, please.
Yes, we're looking into this with our subgroup on data. It's led by AXA Investment Management, and we'll organize a webinar on it on the 28th of September. So I'll put it in the chat as well. People can join. You all can join. Beatrice, welcome too. And of course, Gemma and Magnus, but everyone is welcome.
Okay. Yes, perfect. So more information can be provided.
Yes, and so, maybe good to mention, we did not manage to get a speaker on the SFDR because it's very early stages, but we have a speaker on CSRD. And what I've heard is that SFDR will be building on CSRD later on, but it's very early days yet.
Yeah. So a related question is if any of these initiatives work along with the current development of EU taxonomy on defining activities considering significant contribution to ecosystems. Are you doing that? Magnus, maybe you're not you're starting up now, the TNFD, and you're not as involved.
Well, I'm not myself, but WF is, and I would say all along, it's not, to my knowledge, not yet either. It's not a formal collaboration with the EU, but there are, at least from our side, we have representatives also working on the sustainable finance platform with the EU, so that we are bringing our contributions and our views into both of these work streams. I'm sure there are others as well. And I would just want to point out, when it comes to taxonomy, that it's at the first stage it's been this green taxonomy presented, but as you're probably aware, it's now being further developed into becoming more of a comprehensive taxonomy, which should look into also harmful activities. And they have been they presented here at Swesif just some time ago this red, yellow, green traffic light kind of taxonomy classification system, which I would say is more also in line with the thinking of the TNFD framework, which is not only about disclosing your green or positive impacts, but disclosing your entire impacts, positive and negative, because all investments, all economic activities have impacts. So, but we just need to learn which ones of them are positive or negative, and how do we make sure that we have more of the positive than the negative. So there is an alignment, I would say, in the thinking between these two initiatives and in many of the initiatives and tool developments that I see, that we need to have this whole holistic view when it comes to understanding what is the essential purpose of this. But because I was reflecting on the discussion I had before, or the question about resilience, I would say that the term discussed here in financial sector is stability, which sort of is in parallel to that, because in nature we need resilience, but what's discussed and what's been of concern for financial sectors by governments, central banks and investors is long-term stability. And they are very much of the same, but it's expressed with different words.
Interesting thought there. Thank you. Gemma, about the taxonomy, how's your connection to the development of the taxonomy in relation to biodiversity?
Well, I guess at a higher level, Nathan Fabian, who's our Chief Responsible Investment Officer, is actually the chair of the Sustainable Finance Platform at the moment. So our full policy team is involved, EU policy team is involved with the development of the taxonomy. In specific to the environmental objectives, we're actually still yet as a team to be able to go through those. So I know the consultation has come out to review, and actually we still yet have to find the capacity to review that. So yeah, not much to comment on at this stage.
Okay, thanks. I was also maybe a little bit related to that, how you involve others, like in this principles for investing in nature. Will you also have a contact with science, like Beatrice, for example, to start defining these principles, or how do you work with science?
Yeah, that's a great question. So actually, we're planning to pull together what we're calling a curatorship group, which is bringing together the science, the think tanks, the academia, those that are working, investor networks that are working with investors around finance and nature, bringing them together to actually do some testing with, one is the framing around resilience to start with, and then the actual drafting of the principles. And then the other side is that we will obviously be pulling together the investors themselves as a group to have that conversation, but we'll be keeping the two conversations separate just to give the space for investors to have slightly more candid conversations as a group.
Okay, great, thanks. I would actually also like to ask a question from the chat. Would be interesting to hear your thoughts on that, about Beatrice. This with the Swedish forest companies would you say that they have a sustainable maintenance of the forest, or would EU suggestion, the suggestions from EU improve biodiversity?
You realize, of course, that this is a highly at the moment politicized question, and quite a contentious one. But I will take on this is purely from a scientific perspective.
Yes.
I would say that, as I put in the chat as well, the big Swedish forestry industry companies, they promote what's called the Swedish model. And it is a model that is predominantly focused on clear cutting, so trakthyggesbruk. We know from scientific evidence, and that's cumulative now, it's quite a lot, that that kind of forestry management results in large edges, which results in more storm damage. It has been one of the reasons why we see mostly spruce being planted. We've seen the problems with spruce in terms of susceptibility to various things. So it also reduces biodiversity in lots of different ways that I don't have time to get into here. So I think we can fairly say that it is not a forestry practice that is very well equipped to deal with the new risk landscape that we are going to be seeing in the next few decades. And I will leave it at that. And to just flag that this is a topic that is super important, and we are planning to get into that with the Sustainable Finance Lab as well, to dig deeper into this.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, it's also a balance there with the policy and science, and I think it's really, really important to have this discussion also between, as you say, Gemma, also to bring in scientists early in the discussions, and maybe at some stage you will also mix these groups, which can also be useful, I think, to have this dialogue. Let's see, Anne-Marie, you have a question on the walrus. Maybe you can just put it up.
Yes, okay. Yes, so we're advocating to have finance better included in the global biodiversity framework to be negotiated. But another thing that we think is important, that finance flows should be better aligned. So the combination of finance flows from governments together with what investors and banks are doing. So meaning aligning tax, aligning procurement, aligning subsidies. So eliminating the harmful subsidies, but also transforming them into nature positive or nature resilient incentivizing. So I was wondering to what extent the walrus model could be used by governments to indicate what consequences it might have to adopt tax systems, for example, and whether procurement is also included. So we can advocate governments then to transform their systems.
I don't know, Gustav, do you want to jump in or?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely possible. I would say that to some extent, models such as EMEC that Johan alluded to are actually already considering some of these processes. It is an environmental economic model, so it should have some of those things. The extent to which it has aspects such as biodiversity or like complex ecosystem functions like resilience and that type of stuff, I don't think it's in there. Probably there is scope for expanding this type of analysis. The problem typically is that there's pretty early days when it comes to kind of aggregating data on the economic implications, the socioeconomic implications of, for example, complex things like biodiversity loss, and much of the things that we're expecting to happen still hasn't happened, and hence we don't have data on it. Not having data, on the other hand, shouldn't be a reason why you shouldn't analyze it. So I think there's definitely scope for expanding the analysis, and you have to bring in things like uncertainty and work with bands of uncertainty to kind of at least do some type of analysis on it. Johan, do you want to expand on that or?
No, I guess just more or less kind of confirm what Gustav said. So, I mean, I think the tool itself is well suited for that type of analysis, but I mean, the tool itself cannot kind of solve the issue of, I mean, lack of knowledge and lack of information. So, I mean, you need to put, I mean, parameters basically in the model, and as long as you have parameters to put in the model, I think it's very well suited for that type of analysis. But I mean, yeah, but you still need those parameters that you want to input. Yeah.
Thanks. Always this data question. Just a final question, starting with Beatrice, and maybe if you all other also want to have a say. I think of this with asset owners and asset managers. Can we support the internalization of externalities, or how can we see the role of the finance sector in this, pushing the externalities into the system?
You want me to answer?
Yes.
I'm sure people will have different views on this, but I do see that the internalization of externalities is tricky, of course. It's not something that's going to happen overnight, but the way that I see the importance and influence of the financial sector is that by starting to ask for these measures as you are deciding on your capital allocation decisions, you are effectively creating very strong incentives for companies to start to account for these externalities, even if they're not priced at the moment in the commodities that are being sold or the services. This is another direct, as I see it, influence mechanism, incentive mechanism to start to account for externalities in a way that, getting them priced in an appropriate way is going to take, I don't know how long, and I'm not even sure we can get there. So to me, that's why this is so important.
Yeah, thanks. Anyone else want to say something on the finance sector role in this?
I'd like to reflect on and I was asked the connection to TCFD, and the rationale for TCFD, as they have been pointing out themselves, is to disclose risk and opportunities, but to also present how that has financial implication. In the overview, the model of the TCFD, it's meant to show financial implication, but at least like a year ago, I don't know if progress has been made. TCFD themselves pointed out that there's been a lot of reporting and a lot of narratives, a lot of scenario analysis being done, but so far it's not really been digested or put forward in how that affects companies or investors financially. So that's the next step to be taken for climate in the TCFD process, and it will be really helpful and important to see that happen. So it's not only let's say sort of becomes a storytelling mechanism that we should say that we have these risks and opportunities. It should also, because that's the idea, this should also affect the pricing so that capital are reallocated from the more polluting and emitting to the less and so on. If we can have that lessons from that, it will be really important to see if we can apply a similar process, a similar pricing, repricing function for biodiversity once we start to having the metrics and having the data and having disclosure from the TNFD or the other initiatives. So it's yet to be, the financial sector and companies already using shadow pricing and so on carbon. There's a lot of experience and a lot of things that can and should be done in implementing and testing that and share those lessons learned, so we can get better at pricing nature correctly.
Thanks. So if you are fine, Gemma and Anne-Marie, I will just wrap up the session because time goes quick. I must say this is for sure a challenge for the finance sector and also for society, that we of course need major efforts, major changes are needed. And as you have said, decisions need to be taken under uncertainty and we need to act before all the data is in place. And I just quickly want to squeeze in a short note, putting on my day job hat, that MISTRA, the Swedish Foundation for Strategic Environmental Research, is actually today launching a call on transdisciplinary research funding on the heading of biodiversity and the financial system. So please check that out, and I hope we can contribute there with data and also evaluating these activities going on. And as we have mentioned, in the upcoming Swesif webinar on September the 30th, we will focus on how we can act on biodiversity, and we will present 4 different approaches on how biodiversity can be assessed. It will be presented by ISS ESG, EcoGain, Iceberg Data Lab, and the UNEP World Conservation Monitoring Center. So please join us for that webinar as well. So thank you, everybody who presented and who attended, and also to the colleagues at Swesif. Thank you so much.